The first time I saw Joe Adonis, he wasn't wearing a suit. He was 16, maybe 17, leaning against a lamppost on East 107th Street, cigarette hanging off his lip like it belonged there. Even back then, he had that movie star face, slick hair, dark sharp eyes, a jaw that could cut glass. They said he was Italian, but to the girls, he looked like something out of a Valentino dream. To the boys, he was trouble that walked like a man. He wasn't born into money. He was born into Brooklyn. Dirty shoes, loud corners, food that smelled like home but didn't always fill the stomach. His real name? Giuseppe Antonio Dotto. But that didn't matter. Even the priests called him Joe. And somewhere between shining shoes and stealing bread, he learned something important. You didn't have to be the toughest guy in the room, just the best-looking one with the best connections. Joe understood charm the way other men understood violence. He didn't need to pull a blade when a smile did the job, and when that failed, well, he wasn't afraid of blood. He just preferred not to get his hands too dirty unless he had to. But don't get me wrong, Joe Adonis wasn't just a pretty face. He was smart, quietly, deadly smart. The kind of smart that didn't make noise walking into a room, but always walked out with something. Your trust, your money, or your girl. And he played the long game. Always. That's how he started getting close to Lucky Luciano. Now that's a name you probably know. Luciano had big ideas. He wasn't like the old school bosses still playing by Sicilian rules and holding grudges like rosary beads. Luciano wanted structure, hierarchy, a business, not a blood feud. And when he looked at Joe, he didn't just see a slick operator. He saw a future lieutenant, someone who could stand in a room with judges, cops, and killers, and speak their language, each one different but all fluently. They met over a card game. Not much was said. Joe watched, said little, smiled when he lost, paid his debts in cash and compliments. That's how you build trust in this world, not by winning, but by losing like a man. By the end of that week, Joe was doing small jobs for Luciano. Deliveries mostly, messages, some muscle when needed, nothing flashy. That came later. Back then, New York was changing. The streets had started whispering names like Bugsy, Meyer, Vito, and Frank. Men with ambition, young bloods with cold hearts. Each one had his way. Fists, guns, numbers, women. But Joe had mirrors. He knew people loved to look at themselves, and he gave them back a version of their own desire. Calm, good-looking, confident. He started dressing sharper. Suits tailored in Little Italy, always double-breasted. Shoes that clicked like punctuation on pavement. And cologne, subtle, but always present. Women leaned in, men leaned back. That was the Joe Adonis effect. By the time Prohibition rolled around, Joe was already more than a runner. He had clubs, real ones, places where jazz bled through the walls and bootleg liquor poured like dreams into crystal glasses. Politicians came, cops looked away. And Joe? He smiled, lit another cigarette, and cashed every favor like it was gold. But power never sits still. It moves, it whispers, it schemes. There was a night, soft rain, black streets, no moon. Joe stood outside Club Cyro's, smoking. A man came out, one of his own, and whispered something about a double cross. Joe didn't flinch. He just nodded, finished his cigarette, and walked back in. That man who crossed him? His body was never found. That's how it was with Joe. Soft hands, quiet voice, sharp edges. He wasn't loud like Capone, or cold like Genovese. He was a storm you didn't hear coming, dressed in silk, smiling like he was on a date. But don't be fooled. Underneath that charm, there was steel. Steel forged in Brooklyn's gutters, hardened by poverty, shaped by betrayal, polished by ambition. And all of it hidden behind the most handsome face in the American Mafia. And this was just the beginning. Joe learned early that silence was currency. The less you said, the more people leaned in. In a world full of noise, gunshots in alleys, mothers screaming through thin walls, radios crackling with lies, silence felt like control. And Joe craved control more than money, more than respect. Control was everything. That's what made him dangerous. Not just the fists, not even the connections, but the calm. That stone-slick calm, like a pond hiding something sharp beneath. By 1925, Joe wasn't just some neighborhood pretty boy. He was a man. 24, slicked out, well-fed, with clubs up and down Manhattan and a phone that never stopped ringing. Everybody wanted a favor, a bottle, a loan, a cleanup job. You name it. The Irish came, the Jews came, even the old Sicilian dons who used to laugh at him behind closed doors. They didn't laugh anymore. But Joe didn't climb alone. He had Lucky Luciano, the kind of friend you didn't make lightly. Lucky had a knife-slit grin and eyes that always looked past you, like he was measuring your worth in inches. They were opposites on the outside. Lucky with his scarred face, Joe smooth as polished marble. But underneath, they were the same. Calculated, forward-thinking, brutal when necessary. They weren't loyal to blood. They were loyal to results. Together, they built something new, something cleaner than the old Mafia with its dusty traditions and whispered vendettas. They were businessmen, not butchers. At least, that's what they told themselves. But even businessmen need enforcers. And Joe, for all his polish, knew when to get his hands dirty. There was this one night, a story that stuck around like smoke in a stairwell. One of Joe's guys, a mid-level bookie named Rico Santino, started skimming off the top. Not much. A few hundred here, 1,000 there. Nothing that would bankrupt the operation, but Joe noticed. He always noticed. Now here's the thing. Joe didn't kill Rico. He invited him to dinner. They sat at a small Italian joint in the Bronx. No crowd, just the clink of forks and the soft hum of an accordion. Joe ordered pasta. Rico ordered steak. They talked about women, boxing, baseball, nothing serious. And just when Rico started to relax, napkin tucked into his collar, sipping red wine like he belonged there, Joe leaned in. "You like working for me, Rico?" "Yeah, boss, course," Joe nodded, chewing slowly. "Then why you stealing from me?" Rico froze, stared at him like he'd been caught naked in church. Joe didn't raise his voice, didn't even stop eating. "You took $4,200 over 6 weeks. You were careful, real careful. Thought the small numbers wouldn't catch my eye." He wiped his mouth with a cloth napkin. "But I see everything." Rico opened his mouth, maybe to beg, maybe to lie. Didn't matter. Joe raised a hand. "You're not going to die tonight," he said, "but you're not going to walk out the same either." Joe didn't lay a finger on him. He stood, nodded to a man in the corner, a quiet, thick-necked Sicilian with no name and dead eyes. 10 minutes later, Rico stumbled out the back alley, blood leaking from his left hand, 2 fingers gone, just enough to ruin a grip, not enough to bleed out. That was Joe, measured, controlled, never angry, just exact. And word spread, fast. You steal from Joe, you lose more than money, you lose yourself. His legend grew, not just in New York, but across state lines. He started showing up in Havana, Atlantic City, Chicago. Always dressed for the occasion. 3-piece suits, gold cufflinks, silk ties you couldn't buy in America. The man looked like a senator and moved like a shadow. The kind of guy who could sit at a table with Capone and still command the room. Women loved him, men feared him, cops respected him, or they took his money and looked the other way, and Joe knew how to keep them all in balance. See, some gangsters ruled through fear alone, brutality, blood. Joe didn't need to break bones unless the bones asked for it. His real weapon? Conversation, a quiet sit-down, a promise, or a reminder. He once told a politician, "You help me move liquor through Jersey, I'll help you keep your job." Simple. Clean. And when that politician wavered, Joe didn't send a goon. He sent a priest, Joe's own cousin, a man of God. Whispered something about sins and redemption. The next day, the liquor moved freely, and the politician started attending Sunday Mass like clockwork. That's how deep Joe's roots went. Not just in crime, but in culture, in religion, in law, in everything. But power brings enemies. And the old guard? They hated what Joe and Luciano were building. They saw it as betrayal, a betrayal of the code, of tradition, of Sicily. One man in particular, Salvatore Maranzano, didn't just hate them, he wanted them gone. And Maranzano had soldiers, trained ones, old country killers with quiet feet and cold eyes. It became a silent war. Whispers, shadows, staged accidents. People started disappearing. Bodies showed up in trunks in rivers, in basements. Joe stayed calm. He didn't blink when a grenade blew up his friend's car. Didn't flinch when a bullet shattered the glass at Club La Cosa one night, inches from his head. Instead, he adjusted. Started traveling with fewer men, stayed off the radar, moved meetings to parks, barbershops, rooftops. And when Maranzano finally made his move, tried to have Luciano whacked, Joe was already 2 steps ahead. The plan was simple. Take out Maranzano, cut the head off the snake. Joe didn't carry the knife. He wasn't even in the building that day. But his fingerprints were all over the plan, his silence, his approval. September 10th, 1931, Maranzano lay dead in his office, stabbed and shot by men dressed as federal agents. That was the day the old Mafia died, and the new order began. Joe, Luciano, Genovese, Lansky, they called it the Commission, a board of directors for organized crime. No more boss of all bosses, just structure, territory. Rules, profit over pride. And Joe? He became the face, the gentleman's gangster, polished, professional, untouchable. But success never tastes the same once you've had blood on your hands. They say Joe started losing sleep around 34. He'd lie awake in silk sheets, staring at the ceiling, hearing things that weren't there. Footsteps, whispers, screams from the past. They weren't real, but they weren't gone either. He had a penthouse overlooking the city. Marble floors, glass walls, the whole nine. But it felt cold, empty, like a coffin dressed in gold. Sometimes in the middle of the night, he'd walk barefoot across the tile, look out at the skyline and light a cigarette, smoke curling through the silence like a ghost. He missed Brooklyn, not the poverty, not the hunger, but the realness. The way things used to be, raw, simple, unspoken. In power, everything became politics. Even murder needed approval. He used to know who his enemies were. Now, everyone smiled too much. Everyone shook hands too easily. He didn't trust it. And trust, once it's gone, never really comes back. There was a girl. Always is. Her name was Eva, Cuban, dancer, eyes like slow-burning coals and a voice that could melt granite. Joe met her at one of his clubs, didn't approach right away. Just watched, let her notice him. When he finally did speak, it was just one sentence. Dance with me or break my heart. She laughed, slow and low, and said, Gangsters don't have hearts. Only the good ones, Joe replied. She stayed in his life longer than anyone expected. Not a wife. Joe never married. But she lived in his apartment, cooked him things that reminded him of home, talked to him like he was a man, not a boss. Didn't flinch when he got that look in his eyes, the far-off stare of someone remembering something he couldn't ever talk about. But even she couldn't fix the dreams. He started talking in his sleep, muttering names. Orders, apologies. One night she woke up to find him standing in the dark, eyes wide open but not seeing her, just whispering. It was supposed to be clean. She didn't ask what. She didn't need to. She knew. By the time the feds started coming after him in the late 30s, Joe was already tired. He played the game. Lawyers, payoffs, fake passports, clever lies. He smiled in court, shook hands with judges, donated to churches. But inside, he was worn down. Too many ghosts. Too many rooms he couldn't walk into without seeing blood. They came for him hard in the 40s. Deportation threats, tax charges. Federal heat he couldn't buy his way out of. And all he could think about, as the walls started closing, was that first streetlight on a 107th, the one he leaned against with a cigarette, young and invincible, the world still silent and waiting. Joe had always believed that the smartest man in the room was the one who left the earliest. He didn't like staying too long at parties, never lingered at a meeting once the business was done. When the money hit the table or the handshake closed, he was already halfway to the door. That's how he stayed alive longer than most, in a world where the longer you sat still, the easier you were to aim at. But you can't outrun everything, especially not time. By the early 1940s, Joe was still sharp, still dangerous, still dressed like a Wall Street banker on his wedding day. But the game was changing. The streets were louder now, messier. There were too many kids trying to make names, too many deals being made in bars by boys who didn't know what respect even meant. They didn't earn anything. They wanted it fast. And Joe didn't move fast. He moved right. He still ran the numbers, still collected off the docks. His clubs were still open, liquor still flowing, hands still greased, but the winds were shifting. There were new names in the papers, new rats in the walls, and the feds. They were hungry. Hungry for a big fish. And Joe, he was a trophy. He knew it too. You could see it in the way he watched the world now, slower, less reactive, like a man who hears footsteps behind him but refuses to turn around, because turning around means admitting something's changed. It started small. A subpoena here. A wiretap there. Quiet conversations between men in suits who had no idea who they were playing with. Joe kept smiling through it. Lawyers were paid, judges remembered favors, witnesses got scared. The machine still worked, but it coughed now and then. One night, in 1942, Joe sat at the back of La Scala, a restaurant he half-owned, eating veal cutlets with two of his oldest friends, Frankie Bellomo and Nicky Sinatra, no relation to the singer, though he told everyone there was. They were laughing about something stupid, some drunk Irish guy who thought Joe was a movie producer, when Joe's eyes drifted to the window. A black Buick, parked too long. Windows fogged, nobody inside moved. Joe sipped his wine. Didn't speak. But he knew. Feds. They weren't like street hoods. They didn't try to blend in. They didn't have to. They sat where you could see them. A message, a warning, or maybe a test. Frankie saw it too, leaned in. You want us to handle it? Joe shook his head. You don't handle the law, you outlast it. That was Joe. No panic, no threats, just a slow understanding of pressure. The kind that builds, inch by inch, until a man either bends or snaps. The pressure got worse. They tried tax evasion first. Old trick. They'd done it to Capone. Figured if you couldn't catch a guy with a smoking gun, you get him with a fountain pen. But Joe's books were cleaner than a priest's confessional. Not because he was honest, but because he paid men smarter than the feds. Then came the immigration angle. See, Joe had never been naturalized. He was born in Italy, Montemerano to be exact, and came to America as a kid. The technicality was always there, tucked away like a forgotten card in a loaded deck. But now the government wanted to play it. Deportation. They said he was an undesirable alien, a threat to public order, a criminal who had no right to stay. And Joe? He laughed when he first heard it. They want to send me back? He told Ava one night, pacing the marble floor of his penthouse, shirt unbuttoned, drink in hand. I've been here since I was 5. This country raised me. Eva sat on the edge of the bed, watching him. You think they care? Joe stopped pacing, looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't have a clever line. Because the truth was, no, they didn't care. Not anymore. He met with Luciano at a hotel in Newark, just the two of them. No bodyguards, no assistants. Like old times. Luciano was already a step ahead. He'd been deported too, sent to Italy a few years earlier, after cutting a deal that saved his skin but exiled him from the world he helped build. He wore a crisp white suit now, like a man trying too hard not to look tired. You think fighting it's worth it? Joe asked him, leaning back in the velvet chair. Luciano lit a cigarette, took a drag, exhaled slowly. Only if you like wasting money, Joe smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Luciano kept going. They want to win. They want to say they took down one more of us. And you? He pointed the cigarette at Joe. You're still too clean, too pretty. That makes them nervous. Joe said nothing for a while, just stared out the hotel window at the cars crawling by below. You miss it? He asked finally. New York. Luciano didn't answer right away. Every day. They didn't hug. They didn't shake hands. They just nodded. Men like them didn't need words to say goodbye. Joe tried to fight it, of course. He hired every high-priced lawyer in Manhattan, appealed, stalled, pulled every string he had left. But the tide was too strong. The papers called him a well-groomed menace. The politicians called him a symbol of organized crime. And behind every sentence, behind every headline, was the same cold message. "We don't want you here anymore." Ava was the only one who didn't flinch when the final order came. "They want you gone in 90 days, Joe told her over breakfast one morning. "Italy, no appeal left." She didn't cry, didn't shout, just asked, "Are you going to run?" He shook his head. "They'll follow me to hell." She reached across the table, touched his hand. "Then I'm going with you." He smiled, soft and tired. "You don't belong in hell, baby." She squeezed his fingers. "You do?" Joe didn't answer. His final weeks in New York were quiet. He shut down the clubs, transferred the businesses, paid every man he owed, with interest. No drama, no fire, just silence. It was the most graceful exit the Mafia had ever seen. He spent one last night in Brooklyn, walking the old streets where his name first meant something. The lamppost was still there, the one he leaned on as a kid. Same angle, same rust, different world. He lit a cigarette, stared up at the dark sky. A group of kids passed him, loud, laughing, punching each other's shoulders. One of them bumped into Joe, didn't even notice. Times change. The ship left New York Harbor on a cold morning in January 1956. Joe wore a dark overcoat, black gloves, and sunglasses, even though there was no sun. Reporters swarmed the dock, shouting questions. "Do you regret your life in America? What do you plan to do in Italy? Is this the end for Joe Adonis?" He said nothing. Just smiled that perfect smile one last time and walked up the gangplank. Ava wasn't with him. He'd made her stay. "She doesn't belong to this world," he told his lawyer. "Let her have a real one." He didn't look back, not once. In Italy, he lived quietly. A villa outside Naples. Guards, fences, cameras. The same setup, different flag. But the heart of it all was gone. The game, the city, the power. He still had money, still got calls. But his name faded. The new boys in New York didn't speak of him like they used to. They were busy killing each other in parking garages and pizza shops. There was no honor left, not even fake. Joe grew older, slower. The suit still fit, but the mirror told the truth. And sometimes, late at night, he'd wake up sweating, hearing things again. Names, shots, screams, but mostly silence. Because even the loudest lives eventually go quiet. That was Joe Adonis, the handsome gangster, the man who walked through hell in a tailored suit and smiled the whole way. But even the cleanest hands get stained if you wear the crown long enough. Italy wasn't what Joe remembered. The country he'd left as a boy was all dust and barefoot priests, olive trees, and whispered prayers. The Italy he returned to in exile was colder, suspicious, modern in the ugliest ways. It smelled like bureaucracy, not basil. It didn't open its arms to welcome him. It tolerated him like a bad dream returned. They gave him a villa outside Naples. That's what the papers said anyway. Villa. What it really was a house with high walls and sharp corners, guarded on all sides. A cage for a man too dangerous to kill, but too inconvenient to keep. He had no neighbors, just guards, both official and unofficial. Some were Italian intelligence. Others were men from New York who followed him over. Loyal ones. Old-school types who'd rather disappear from their families than leave Joe alone. They called it Exile. But really, it was just a slow-motion funeral. Joe tried to adjust. He walked the garden paths in the mornings, tended to the lemon trees himself, hands rougher than most people thought, woke early, slept late, ate pasta he couldn't taste, smoked cigars that felt like chewing on ashes. He read old newspapers, played cards with himself, listened to the radio like it might say his name by accident. He didn't drink much. Never had. Liquor was for the weak, for the sloppy. Joe liked to feel everything. The pain, the paranoia, the empty silence that hung over the hills like a wet blanket. He'd sit by the window at night, staring out into the dark, watching the driveway like a dog waiting for a ghost, because ghosts were all he had left. At first, men came to visit, some from Naples, some from Palermo, old Mafia names, younger sons of older bosses. They came out of respect or fear or curiosity. They brought gifts, wine, watches, women. They asked for advice, blessings, connections. Joe gave them nothing. Just a look, maybe a sentence, sometimes a warning. "I'm out," he'd say. "This ain't my world anymore." Some didn't believe him. Some tried to push. One kid, 20-something, slick hair, gold tooth, asked if Joe wanted in on a heroin shipment out of Sicily. Joe didn't say a word, just stood up from the table and left the kid sitting there, alone, sweating into his espresso. That was Joe's message. You don't ask a lion to come back to the hunt after he's already buried his teeth. But time doesn't care about legacy. As the months bled into years, the visits stopped. The phone rang less, letters slowed. The world moved on, just like it always does. Names like Gallo, Castellano, Gotti started replacing the ones Joe grew up with. They weren't gangsters, not in the old way. They were rock stars with guns, no loyalty. No class, just TV cameras and loud suits and bodies stacked in restaurants like bad art. Joe didn't envy them. He pitied them. They didn't know how fast it could all fall apart, how quiet it could all end. And maybe that's what scared him most. Not dying, but being forgotten. One evening, he got a letter from Eva, the first in over a year. Postmarked New York. Plain envelope, handwriting like rain. She said she missed him, that the city wasn't the same. That she kept his picture in her wallet, and sometimes, when the streets were quiet, she could still hear his voice. She didn't ask for anything, didn't offer much either. Just reminded him he'd been real. Joe folded the letter neatly and put it in a drawer with all the others. Never wrote back. What would he say? "I'm still breathing, but it doesn't feel like living. I spend my days listening to birds and wondering how many people I buried too early." No, that wasn't a message you sent someone you loved. The dreams got worse. They always started the same. Him walking down a hallway. Clean floors, empty frames on the walls. A slow echo behind him. Footsteps. He never turned around. He couldn't. Sometimes it was Frankie Bellomo, shot in the back of the head in a warehouse Joe owned but never admitted to. Sometimes it was Rico Santino missing his fingers, mouthing silent curses through bloodied teeth. Other times, it was himself, younger, prettier, full of smoke and fire, looking back at him with disappointment. "You wanted all this," the younger Joe would whisper. "Now choke on it." He'd wake up in a sweat, heart pounding, ears ringing with silence. Always silence. One day in 1959, he received a visit from Father Mariano, an old man with a slow gait and eyes that saw straight through lies. Joe had known him as a boy in Brooklyn, the only man who ever called him by his birth name, Giuseppe. They sat in the garden under a lemon tree, drinking bitter coffee in the shade. "You still believe in God?" the priest asked him. Joe shrugged. "I believe in gravity. God's been too quiet." The priest didn't smile, just stared at him. "You still have time." Time for what? To ask forgiveness. Joe looked at him, held his gaze. "I never killed anyone who didn't deserve it." Father Mariano leaned back, quiet. Let the wind speak for a moment. Then, "That's not how forgiveness works." Joe lit a cigarette, took a long drag. "Then maybe it's not for me." The priest didn't argue, just placed a small wooden cross on the table and left without saying goodbye. Joe stared at it for a long time, never touched it, just let it sit there, rotting in the sun. By 1960, his health started to fail. Not in big ways, no strokes, no heart attacks, just slow decay, like a house left to rot in the rain. His stomach turned on him first, couldn't eat without pain. His hands shook, sleep got harder, the world lost its color, even the suits felt heavy now, like armor on a tired knight who hadn't fought in years. Doctors came, gave him pills, diets, false hope. But Joe didn't care. He wasn't afraid of dying. He just didn't want to die alone. One morning, he sat at the garden table with a photo of his mother. Black and white, edges curled. She died before he made it big. Never saw the clubs, the cars, the headlines. She only knew Giuseppe, the quiet boy who hated school but never let anyone push him around. "I made it, Ma," he whispered. And maybe for the first time in years, he felt something real. Not pride, not regret, just weight, something heavy in his chest that refused to let go. That night, he didn't dream of ghosts. He dreamed of home. Brooklyn, the tenement building, the way the hallway smelled after Sunday dinner, kids playing stickball in the street, the first time he tied his shoes without help, the way his mother wiped sauce from his face with her apron, humming something soft. He woke up with tears on his face, and no one there to see them. Italy had a way of making silence feel permanent. Out in the hills beyond Naples, the world barely moved. The sky stayed still, the trees whispered soft, and time passed like an old man walking with a limp, slow, stubborn, never in a rush. Joe sat with it daily, coffee in one hand, a cigarette burning itself down in the other, watching the shadows shift across his garden walls. This was life now. No phone calls, no meetings, no street business, just memories that didn't know when to shut up. He still wore the suits, pressed every morning, collar stiff, shoes shined. Maybe it was habit, maybe it was pride, or maybe it was fear. Fear that if he stopped dressing like Joe Adonis, he'd finally become what the papers called him, an aging exile in a forgotten villa. They didn't know him, not really, but that line stung, because on most days, it wasn't wrong. The villa had 3 floors, but felt smaller with each passing year. The ground floor was where he spent most of his time, dining room, study, garden access. Upstairs had the bedroom, guest quarters, and an old bathtub that groaned when filled. The 3rd floor was just dust and boxes, untouched since the day he moved in. He didn't go up there anymore. That part of the house felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by time itself. Every floorboard up there creaked like it was accusing him of something. He lived with 2 men, Luca and Pietro, bodyguards he'd brought from the States. They weren't young anymore either. Both had been with him since the Luciano days. Big guys, thick necks, tired eyes. They didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't ask questions, and didn't leave unless ordered. They cooked, they stood watch. They drank their espresso in silence and nodded like statues. Loyal. Joe didn't call them friends, though. He didn't believe in that word anymore. Every now and then, someone would still try to make contact. A letter, a rumor, a name whispered from Naples or Palermo, asking if the old lion still had teeth. But Joe didn't bite anymore. He wasn't interested in their games. Drug routes, black market weapons, crooked politicians, none of it mattered to him now. Not really. He'd built an empire once, and now he just wanted to survive it. But then, one morning, everything changed. It was a Thursday. Cool air. Sunlight dripping through the olive trees like gold on stone. Joe was in his study, reading an old American newspaper from months ago. Yellowed, thin, the kind of paper that left ink on your fingertips. And then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps against the front door. Luca and Pietro looked up at the same time. No one knocked at that door, not unless they were stupid or serious. Joe stood up without a word and walked to the entrance. Luca was already there, hand on his sidearm. Pietro stood just behind, quiet as always. Joe waved them off. "Let him in," he said, without asking who it was. The door creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was a man Joe hadn't seen in 23 years. Anthony Tony Red Corvino. Back in the day, Tony was a mid-tier enforcer for one of Joe's rackets in Jersey, back when gambling ran through back rooms and every winning ticket had a bloodstain behind it. Tony was tough, stupid, and loyal, in that order. But now he looked like life had chewed him up and spit out the bones. He was thinner, face hollow, one eye lazy from an old knife wound, hair gone white under his cap. He smelled like rust and cheap cigarettes. And he was crying, not sobbing, not breaking down. But tears were there, crawling down the lines on his face, unapologetic and real. Joe didn't flinch. "Jesus," he said, voice low. "I thought you were dead." Tony stepped inside, head bowed. "I should be." Joe led him to the garden, waved off the guards, and poured 2 glasses of grappa. He didn't say anything for a long while. Just let the silence settle, heavy and full. Tony finally broke it. "I didn't know where else to go." Joe sipped slowly. "Who's chasing you?" "Everybody." Joe raised an eyebrow. "That narrows it down." Tony laughed, dry and cracked. "They're saying I flipped, told the feds about shipments in Palermo, said I gave up names, bosses, routes." "Did you?" Tony met his eyes. "No, not a damn word." Joe stared at him for a long time, then looked away. "Why come here?" he asked. Tony hesitated. "Because no one else would let me in. They either want me dead, or they already think I am." Joe nodded slowly. "And what do you think I'm going to do? Offer you sanctuary?" "No," Tony said. "I just wanted to see a face that wasn't trying to kill me." They sat there a while, drinking in silence. The birds chirped. The sky hung quiet. But something in Joe's stomach twisted. Not from fear, from memory. Tony represented everything Joe had left behind. The blood, the betrayal, the world that eats its own and never says sorry. But deeper than that, Tony was a mirror, older now, broken. Hollowed out by years of service to a cause that never really loved him back. And Joe knew, deep down, that if you stripped the suits, the cigars, the marble floors, he and Tony were the same man, just ghosts in different stages of fading. Tony stayed the night. Joe let him sleep in the guest room, no questions asked. Pietro stood guard at the door. Luca patrolled the perimeter. No calls were made. No one knew. But Joe didn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe. He couldn't shake the feeling that this visit was a warning, not just about Tony's enemies, but about his own time running out. Because men like Joe, they don't die with family holding their hands. They die in silence, in exile, in paranoia, alone, unless they decide otherwise. The next morning, Tony was gone. No note, no sound, nothing missing. Just the faint smell of tobacco in the hallway and a cup of untouched coffee on the counter. Joe stared at the cup for a long time. Then he walked back to his study, opened the drawer, and pulled out the letter from Ava, the one he never answered. He sat down, and for the first time in 2 decades, he picked up a pen. The pen felt heavier than it should have. Joe sat there, hunched over the desk in his study, sunlight bleeding through the tall window behind him. Outside, the olive trees stood still, unmoved by the morning breeze. Inside, the only sound was the faint scratch of the fountain pen tip hesitating above the paper. He hadn't written to anyone in decades, not by hand, not by heart, but there it was. Ava's letter, unfolded on the table beside him, yellowed, soft at the edges, the scent of lavender long faded. Her words were brief, but they hung in the room like smoke from a cigar that refused to burn out. She'd written it over a year ago, but Joe never answered, never dared to. What could he say? What could a man like him ever say that wouldn't sound like a lie? But now, something was different. Tony Red's sudden visit, the desperation in his eyes, the way he vanished without a word. It reminded Joe that nothing is ever done, not in their world, not really. If death was going to come, and it was, Joe wanted to send one message out before the curtain dropped. So he started to write. Ava, I don't know what you remember of me. Maybe the suits, the sharp words, the money, maybe the clubs, the dinners, the smell of cigars that clung to my skin like it belonged there. Maybe that's all I was to you, a good coat with bad pockets. If so, I wouldn't blame you. But in case you're still holding on to anything softer, let me tell you what life's been like for me out here. Quiet. Too quiet. He paused, looked out the window for a moment, then continued, slower now, more deliberate. He wasn't writing a love letter, he wasn't that poetic, but he was telling the truth, and for Joe Adonis, that was rarer than a clean politician. The birds here start chirping before dawn, same time every day. The sky goes from ink to bone to gold in about 20 minutes. I sit in the garden most mornings, trying to pretend I'm just an old man enjoying retirement. But it's not retirement, it's exile. They dressed it up, gave it a passport and a villa and a couple of guards, but it's just a cage with Italian linen. The thing that hurts the most isn't the silence. It's how easy it is to get used to. He set the pen down and rubbed his eyes. Luca passed by the study doorway, silent as always, nodding once. Pietro was already outside on the patio, cleaning his pistol as if it would ever be needed again. Joe hadn't had a real threat in years. No shooters, no agents, just paranoia, that old friend that never missed a visit. But lately, he'd started to feel it again, that static in the air, that weight behind the eyes. Something was shifting. Tony Red didn't show up for nothing, and he sure as hell didn't disappear for fun. Joe picked the pen up again. I'm not reaching out to beg for forgiveness. I'm not that far gone. I'm just trying to leave a window open, one that we both closed too early. I think about you more than I should. There's this song that plays on the radio sometimes, a soft one. No words, just piano. It reminds me of how you looked the morning after our last fight, sitting on the edge of the bed with your arms wrapped around your knees, hair a mess, eyes tired, but never cruel. You looked like a woman who had decided something final, and I didn't stop you. I regret that, more than any bullet I ever dodged. He stopped again. His hand shook slightly as he reached for his glass. The grappa burned going down, too sharp for morning, but necessary. That was the thing no one ever said about getting old. It's not the body that breaks first. It's the wall around your emotions. And Joe's walls, thick as they were, had started to crack. He looked at Eva's old photo on the shelf, the one from Havana where they danced barefoot in some marble hotel hallway after the club closed. She'd worn red, he'd worn white. And for once, there'd been no blood on anything. The truth is, I never stopped thinking about you. I just buried it beneath work. Then, beneath silence. Then, beneath guilt. It was easier to be Joe Adonis than to be the man who let you walk away. I'm writing this because something's changed. A man I used to know, Tony Red, showed up here last week. Just walked through my door looking like a ghost that hadn't finished its haunting. He's running from something. I don't know what yet. But he brought more than trouble. He brought the past. And that past, it's not done with me. Joe sighed. That was the hard part, really, admitting it. That the past was alive and still hungry. Most men think time dulls pain, but in the life Joe lived, time only makes the ghosts louder. And lately, they weren't whispering anymore. They were screaming. I won't ask you for anything. I just wanted to say it, out loud, on paper, without shame. You were the one part of my life that wasn't built on fear, money, or violence, and I left it behind like it didn't matter. That was my greatest mistake. If you ever want to see me again, I'll be here. You'll find me under the lemon trees. Joe. He folded the letter neatly, sealed it in an envelope, and slid it into a drawer. He didn't send it. Not yet. Instead, he stood up, walked into the hallway, and looked at Pietro. Get the car, he said. Pietro blinked. Where to? The coast. There's a man I want to speak to. Joe hadn't left the villa in months, but today, he needed movement, air, a reminder that the world hadn't entirely erased him. They drove 2 hours along the coastal roads, curves sharp enough to slice a tire, the sea glistening like broken glass to their left. Pietro drove. Joe sat in the back, smoking with the window down, hair whipping in the wind like he was 30 years younger. They arrived at a stone villa tucked into the cliffs, half hidden by cypress trees. An old friend lived there, Alessandro Viti, once a liaison between Italian and American operations, retired now, or so he claimed. Joe didn't bother knocking. He walked straight in. Alessandro met him in the atrium, barefoot, wearing a robe. Jesus, he muttered, I thought you were a ghost. Joe lit a cigarette. Not yet, but I've got one following me. They sat down, talked. At first, pleasantries, then names, then blood. Joe mentioned Tony Red. Alessandro stiffened. He came to you? Yeah. You're not safe, Joe. I haven't been for a long time. No, Alessandro said, voice low. I mean it. He's a target. They'll kill anyone who hides him. Joe didn't flinch. Who's they? Alessandro hesitated. New York's changed. Younger bosses, hungrier, more desperate. There's a cleaning going on. Of what? Of anyone who remembers the old rules. Joe sat back. The sun through the atrium window cut across his face, casting half of it in shadow. And in that moment, something inside him clicked. The past hadn't come back to haunt him. It came to pull him back in. And this time, he wasn't walking away. The drive back from Vitti's villa was quiet. Joe sat in the back seat, window down, one hand resting on the sill. The breeze tugging at the collar of his suit. He didn't speak. Pietro didn't ask questions. That's the way it had always been with his men. Loyal silence. But this time, silence wasn't enough. Joe's mind was racing. Not with fear, not even with anger, but with clarity. Something was happening back in New York. Something big. Tony Red didn't show up out of panic. He showed up as a warning. And now that warning was blooming into something darker, something inevitable. The game had changed. But Joe was still a player, whether they remembered him or not. By the time they got back to the villa, the sun was low. The hills around Naples glowed amber, and the birds had gone quiet, the way they always did right before the dark settled in for the night. Joe didn't go inside. Instead, he walked out to the lemon grove at the back of the property. It was wild now, not maintained like it used to be. Weeds crept around the trunks, leaves browned at the edges, but the trees still bore fruit, bitter, stubborn fruit, just like the man walking through them. He reached up and pulled one down, rolled it in his hand, looked at it like it had answers, and then he spoke, soft and sharp. Get me Vito Alessi on the phone. Vito Alessi was a name most people forgot. Small-time consigliere from Jersey who'd worked under Joe in the late 40s, Vito was never loud, never flashy. He handled the books, whispered in the right ears, and disappeared before things got messy. Joe hadn't spoken to him in over 20 years, but if anyone knew what was going on in New York, who was moving the pieces, who wanted the old names buried, it'd be Vito. It took 3 days to get him on the line. The call was routed through Naples, then through Sicily, then finally bounced to a payphone in Queens. When Joe picked up, he didn't waste time. It's me, he said, silence on the other end. Then a breath. Jesus Christ, Vito muttered. They said you were dead. Joe grinned. They say a lot of things. What the hell do you want? Information. Vito hesitated. Joe could hear traffic in the background, horns, a siren, the deep echo of city noise. It made his chest ache. About Tony Red, Joe added. Another pause. Longer this time. You shouldn't be asking about that. I'm not asking, Joe said. I'm telling you. Vito sighed. He flipped. That's what they're saying. He told me he didn't. Yeah, well, people say a lot of things when they're scared. You believe it? No. Joe raised an eyebrow. That surprised him. Tony was a pain in the ass, Vito said, but he was loyal, stupid loyal, the kind that dies with your name on his lips. So why are they hunting him? Because the new bosses don't care if it's true. They want to send a message. Clean house, start fresh. Joe felt it then, that old fire, the one he hadn't felt in years. It started low in his gut, hot and sharp, and spread upward like a match catching on silk. They're scrubbing the past, he said quietly. Yeah, Vito replied, and you're a big part of that past. Joe hung up the phone and stared out over the hillside. It was starting to make sense now. Tony Red was the beginning. A low-level name from a forgotten era. But there would be more. They wouldn't stop at the bottom of the tree. They'd climb until every old leaf was stripped and burned. And Joe Adonis, he wasn't just a leaf, he was part of the root. That night, Joe sat down and opened a box he hadn't touched in over a decade. Inside, names, old contacts, bank accounts, safe deposit keys, photos, numbers written on napkins, dates scribbled on yellowed business cards. It was the skeleton of a life that was supposed to be dead. And yet, here it was, breathing again. He lit a cigar. The smoke curled in the room like an old friend returning after a long absence, and he began to write down the names of the men he trusted, the ones who might still answer if he called. The list wasn't long. Carmine Fortino, jersey runner turned arms dealer. Leo Marchesi, bookie with half a face, operated out of Detroit. Nino Basso, longshoreman union fixer, still moving crates through the port of Newark. Benny Lupo, quiet, lethal, vanished after the '57 summit but rumored to be living under a fake name in Spain. Joe circled each one. If he was going to act, if he was going to do something before death claimed him for good, he needed eyes, ears, and reach. Because the boys back in New York? They didn't think he could still move. They thought he was buried in the dirt of some forgotten hillside. And Joe smiled. They were wrong. The next week, two things happened that confirmed everything. First, a man named Mikey Sarno was found dead in a Queens alley. Bullet in the mouth, hands tied, body still warm when the papers arrived. Mikey was a relic, used to collect for the Crofazzi family. Hadn't done anything major in years. Just ran numbers and made sandwiches in his cousin's deli. Dead. For no reason other than his name being from the wrong era. Second, Joe received a letter. No name, no return address, just 4 words. You're next. Stay buried. He read it 3 times, didn't even blink. Then he called Pietro and Luca into the study. We're going back to New York. They looked at him like he'd gone senile. You'll be arrested, Luca said flatly. Deported again, or worse. Joe nodded. Probably. Then why? Joe lit a cigarette and blew the smoke upward. Because when a man builds a kingdom, he doesn't just watch it burn from a distance. He stood slowly, walked to the window, and stared out at the hills one last time. I'll let them forget me once, he said. I won't let them bury me. The next morning, plans were in motion. Old passports, fake IDs, cash and currencies Joe hadn't used since before the war. Pietro made the calls. Luca booked the flights. Everything had to be silent, fast, and clean. Joe didn't tell Ava, not yet. He didn't want his last words to her to come in a letter he hadn't found the courage to send. If he survived, he'd look her in the eye and say everything he meant to. If he didn't, then maybe silence would be the only apology he deserved. 3 days later, they landed in Lisbon. From there, a private plane to Quebec, then a car down to Buffalo, then, finally, the edge of New York. The city hadn't changed in the way Joe expected. It was louder, faster, but somehow emptier. The faces on the billboards were different. The clothes, the slang, the noise. But under it all, the hunger was the same. The same streets, the same dirt, the same scent of ambition, blood, and betrayal. Joe Adonis was home, and someone was going to pay for forgetting what that meant. New York didn't greet Joe when he came back. It didn't owe him anything anymore. No one was waiting at the airport. No cars with tinted windows, no familiar voices calling his name through the crowd. Just cold air, impatient cab drivers, and a skyline that had grown taller and meaner in his absence. He stepped off the plane like a man stepping into a dream, one that used to belong to him. Luca and Pietro followed close behind. Both of them were dressed like civilians now. Clean jeans, jackets, no obvious heat. They'd aged, but they still moved like soldiers. Quiet, calculated, eyes always scanning, minds always counting exits. Joe wore gray, not black, not navy. Gray. The kind of color that let you vanish in plain sight. They didn't go to Manhattan. Not yet. Instead, they headed to Brooklyn, where it had all started. Bensonhurst was unrecognizable. The bakeries were still there, but they didn't smell the same. The streets were filled with kids wearing headphones and sneakers that cost more than suits. Everyone had a phone in their hand, heads down, moving fast but going nowhere. Joe stood outside a barbershop on 18th Avenue and stared at the window. It used to be a numbers joint. Back in the 30s, that window had been a one-way mirror. You walked in for a haircut and walked out with your bets placed. Quiet, smooth, efficient. Now it had LED signs, QR code discounts, and a kid blasting trap music inside while giving a fade to some teenager who didn't even know what a straight razor looked like. Joe didn't smile. He didn't frown either. He just felt disconnected, like a ghost walking through the house he built. But the furniture had been rearranged and no one remembered his name. They checked into a safe house in Gravesend. Basement apartment, iron door, no windows, one way in, one way out. Joe sat on the couch for hours that night, chain smoking. He wasn't trying to adjust. He wasn't chasing memories. He was listening. Because a city talks if you stay quiet long enough. And this city, it was screaming. The next day, he made his first real move, Carmine Fortino. The name circled in red on Joe's list. Arms dealer. Ran a crew out of Staten Island. Used to answer to Joe back when men still respected chain of command. Joe didn't call. Didn't write. He showed up. The warehouse looked the same. Dirty brick, metal doors, graffiti on the back wall that no one bothered to clean. But the guards were young. Too young. Kids with bad posture and cheap attitudes. One of them stepped up when Joe tried to enter. "Warehouse is closed, old man." Joe lit a cigarette, took his time. "I'm here for Carmine." The kid laughed. "Carmine don't do walk-ins." Joe stepped forward real slow, just close enough for the kid to smell the smoke on his breath. "Tell him it's Joe Adonis." The name landed like a slow bullet. The kid blinked. His mouth twitched. Then he turned and disappeared inside. 5 minutes later, Carmine came out. Bigger than Joe remembered. Rounder face, balding. But his eyes, those narrow, twitchy eyes, still held that nervous intelligence Joe had always liked. "Joe," he said. "Christ, I know what you thought." They stared at each other. No handshake, just mutual understanding. Joe looked around. "You got cameras in there?" 6. "Turn them off." Carmine hesitated, then nodded to one of his guys. The kid vanished inside. Joe stepped through the door, and for the first time in 20 years, he walked back into business. The office was tight. Old steel desk, maps on the wall, liquor in a drawer. A handgun rested beside the phone, covered in dust but close enough to be dangerous. Joe sat. Carmine poured a drink. They didn't talk for the first few minutes, just sipped and stared. Then Joe got to it. "I'm not here to play house," he said. "I'm here because someone put a bullet in Mikey Sarno's mouth last week. And a few days before that, Tony Red walked through my door in Italy, scared out of his mind." Carmine's smile faded. "I heard," he said. Joe leaned forward. "What's going on, Carm?" Carmine shifted in his chair. "You sure you want to know? I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." The next 20 minutes changed everything. Carmine laid it out clean. A new generation had taken over, some connected to the old names, some just vultures who filled the vacuum. There were no rules anymore, no sit-downs, no votes, no codes. It was money or bullets now, no in between. The guys running the show, they didn't grow up earning stripes. They didn't kiss rings or build crews. They inherited their seats like spoiled kids getting keys to a kingdom they never built. Joe listened, silent. Then came the real bomb. "They're calling it the purge," Carmine said. "Anybody over 50 with a story gets taken out, even if you're retired, even if you're in exile." Joe didn't blink. "They think you're part of the old guard, think you might rally loyalty, so they're preemptively erasing anyone with weight." "And Tony?" "Tony tried to warn a few people, slipped through the cracks. That made them paranoid." "Where is he now?" "Dead," Carmine said quietly. "Found in a motel bathroom outside Philly. Throat slit. No prints, no cameras, just a message." Joe's throat tightened. Not from surprise, from confirmation. Tony Red had come to him in good faith, and died because of it. There was blood on his hands now. Joe stood slowly, put the glass down, adjusted his cuffs. "Thank you, Carm." Carmine nodded. "What are you going to do?" Joe looked him in the eyes. "I'm going to remind them why men like me were feared in the first place." Back at the safe house that night, Luca and Pietro were waiting. Joe sat down, lit a cigarette, and laid out the map. "We're not here to survive," he said. "We're here to make noise." They listened. No questions. They were ready. Joe circled 3 names on the map, 3 new players who'd taken seats at the table that Joe once ruled. Kids pretending to be bosses, pretending that the world didn't remember the real wolves. "They forgot me," Joe said. "Time to fix that." There's something dangerous about a man who's lived through it all, especially when he comes back with nothing left to prove. Joe Adonis wasn't in New York for nostalgia. He wasn't chasing old glories, and he sure as hell wasn't trying to play nice with the kids pretending to run things. He came back to clean up, one name at a time. His first target wasn't the biggest, wasn't even a boss. But that's exactly why Joe picked him. Danny Betaro, 32, loudmouth, ran a mid-level crew in Queens handling gambling and small-time collections. The kind of guy who got made for the wrong reasons. Not because he earned it, but because his uncle died in prison and left a few favors behind. Danny was one of the new types. No discipline, no respect. He posted pictures of himself online holding stacks of cash, wore sneakers to sit-downs, talked about expanding operations like it was a TikTok hustle. But worst of all, he was involved in Tony Red's cleanup. Carmine had confirmed it. Danny gave the nod to the kid who cut Tony's throat. Didn't pull the blade himself, wouldn't risk dirtying his new leather jacket, but the order had his stink all over it. And Joe wasn't going to let that slide. He planned it the old way. No electronics, no text messages, no car bombs or wild shootouts. This wasn't about chaos. It was about precision, fear. Joe spent 3 nights watching Danny's routine. The kid was predictable, like most cowards. Lived in a high-rise in Astoria with 2 girlfriends who didn't know about each other. Hit the same steakhouse every Friday. Same table, same cigar after dinner. He walked like a man who thought he was invincible. That would make it easier. On the 4th night, Joe suited up. Gray again, wool coat, gloves, nothing flashy, nothing to remember. Pietro drove. Luca waited in a secondary car across the street, watching exits, engine running. Joe didn't carry a gun, not for this. He carried a blade, 4 inches, straight edge, wrapped in cloth. Old school. The steakhouse was loud when he entered. Music, clinking glasses, young men shouting over each other about sports and money they didn't actually earn. Joe stood in the lobby for a few seconds, letting his presence sink in. The hostess, couldn't be older than 21, looked him up and down. "You have a reservation?" He smiled, soft and polite. "Tell Danny Betaro someone's here to settle his tab." She blinked. "Excuse me?" Joe just looked past her, eyes locking with a waiter carrying a tray toward the back. Danny's table. The waiter stopped cold when he saw Joe. Recognition flickered. Old blood still whispered in the cracks of this city, and Joe's face? It was legend. He didn't need an introduction. The waiter turned, walked toward Danny's table, whispered something. Joe waited, one hand in his pocket, thumb brushing the blade handle like a nervous habit. When Danny saw Joe, he laughed, loud and stupid. The kind of laugh that comes from a man who knows his bodyguards are 3 feet away and his name's been in enough headlines to make him feel bulletproof. "Well, look who finally crawled out of his grave," Danny called across the restaurant. "Joe fucking Adonis." Joe didn't respond, just walked forward, slow, calm, the way a surgeon walks toward a patient. Danny stood up, all swagger. He wore a velvet jacket, thin gold chains, too many rings. His haircut looked like it cost more than the car Joe rode in on. "You lost, old man?" Joe stopped a few feet from him, looked him in the eye. "You remember Tony Red?" Danny's smile slipped, just a little. Joe continued, voice even, low. "He came to me because he didn't know who to trust. Thought maybe one of the old names would still have a shred of honor." Danny chuckled. "He was a rat." "No," Joe said. "He was loyal and stupid. That's why he died." Joe stepped closer. "Thing is, you signed the paper." Danny blinked. "What paper?" Joe's voice dropped to a whisper. "The one that said loyalty means nothing. The one that said rats get cut and the old rules don't apply." "You signed it when you let him bleed out in a dirty motel like he was nothing," Danny sneered. You think you scare me? Joe smiled. No. And then he moved. It happened fast, faster than anyone at the table could react. Joe's left hand reached out, grabbing Danny by the collar. The right hand slid the blade from his pocket, and in one clean motion, he sank it into Danny's side just beneath the ribs. Not deep enough to kill. Not yet. Danny gasped, hands flailing, blood already soaking his expensive jacket. Joe leaned in close. This isn't the kill, he whispered. This is the invitation. Then he twisted the blade. Danny screamed. The restaurant exploded into chaos, people shouting, backing away, some pulling phones. But Joe was already walking toward the exit, calm as a priest leaving a confessional. Pietro met him at the curb, opened the door. They drove off before the first siren hit the block. Later that night, the call came, an untraceable number. Joe picked up on the first ring. "You're insane," Carmine said. "They're going to put a price on your head." Joe lit a cigarette. "Good. That means they're listening. You think this is 1952? These kids don't play fair. They'll light up entire restaurants to prove a point." Joe exhaled smoke through his nose. "So will I." Carmine went quiet. Then he said, "Danny's alive. Lost a kidney. Barely. But the word's out. They're talking." "Good." Joe hung up. The next morning, Luca laid 3 newspapers on the table. Each one had a different headline. All of them mentioned the stabbing. Only one mentioned Joe's name. But that was enough. It had begun. Joe didn't celebrate, didn't gloat. He went to the window, coffee in hand, and watched the early traffic crawl through Gravesend. The city was still waking up, yawning, stretching, pretending it hadn't been bleeding since the 90s. But something else was stirring now. Fear. The kind of fear that only comes when an old name walks back into the room and doesn't ask permission. That evening, Pietro handed him a note, scrawled in sharp handwriting. No signature. Just an address, warehouse, Gowanas, 1 a.m., bring friends. Joe stared at it, then smiled. A meeting, no threats, no games, an acknowledgement. He called Carmine. "Think they'll show up?" "Maybe," Carmine said, "but if they do, don't expect wine and handshakes." Joe chuckled. "I'm not bringing wine." 103. Gowanas, Brooklyn. The warehouse looked like it hadn't seen daylight in years. Joe stood outside with Luca and Pietro flanking him, staring at the rusted roll-up door. Rain tapped lightly on the concrete. A single bulb hung above the side entrance, flickering just enough to make the whole thing feel like a setup, which it probably was. But Joe didn't flinch. He was dressed in black this time. Wool coat, no tie, gloves on, eyes sharp. He looked like a funeral had arrived early and he was the one delivering it. Pietro looked toward him. "Sure you want to walk in there?" "No," Joe said, "but I will." Luca knocked 3 times. Silence. Then the door slid open. The room inside was a slab of old concrete in shadows, 1 light over the center table, 2 folding chairs. Crates lining the walls, no echoes, no ambient noise. Just the sound of leather soles on the ground as Joe walked in, followed by his 2 men. And there they were, 3 of them. Matty Ricci, young, built like a boxer, 24 tattoos and not enough brains to match. Lil Sal Spinelli, slick, suit too tight, breath reeking of whiskey and ambition. Marco Trina, quiet, older, eyes like a snake, the real mind behind the meeting. They were the new generation, the ones who'd risen from the ashes of families long dead, turning legacy into leverage. They didn't respect history. They monetized it. And tonight, they were nervous. They didn't expect Joe to show up in person. They thought he'd send a messenger, a warning, a threat. They didn't understand that Joe Adonis never whispered. He stepped into the circle of light and looked around. "Cozy," he said. "Didn't expect chairs." Matty snorted. "You expected to walk in at all?" Joe met his eyes. "No, I expected to be shot on sight. You're slipping, kid." That landed. Matty's jaw clenched. Lil Sal leaned back in his chair, trying too hard to look casual. "We thought it'd be more respectful. We heard you like that sort of thing." Joe smiled thinly. "Respect is usually offered before you cut a man's throat." Silence. No one answered. Joe stepped forward, unbuttoning his coat as he did. "I'm not here to negotiate," he said. "I'm here to correct a mistake." Marco finally spoke, voice low, calm but sharp. "We didn't invite you here for a lecture." Joe turned to him. "Then you've already wasted my time." He pulled out a chair, sat down, and placed his gloved hands on the table. "You boys think you're running something. You're not," Lil Sal smirked. "And what do you think you're running? A nostalgia tour?" Joe let that hang. Then he leaned forward, slow and measured. "I ran this city when your fathers were still asking permission to leave the dinner table." He turned to Matty. "Your old man? He begged Lucky Luciano for protection after he shot a kid over a poker debt. Know how I know?" Matty didn't answer. Joe smiled. "Because I made the call that saved his life." Then, to Lil Sal. "Your Uncle Salvatore? He was a doorman. Ran a racket on 49th and 10th. He'd collect $20 and piss himself when the real guys came around." Silence again. Joe tapped the table. "You built your little empire on the bones of men like me. And now you're tearing it down like it never meant anything." Marco's eyes didn't leave Joe's. "Time changes things. We adapt or die." Joe nodded. "Sure. But when you start killing your own, that's not adapting. That's cowardice." Lil Sal chuckled, masking nerves with arrogance. "Tony Red was a liability. He opened his mouth." "He opened it to me," Joe snapped. That shut him up. "I gave him a safe place to breathe for one night," Joe said. "And you sent a butcher to silence him like a dog. That's not business, that's treason." Matty leaned in. "This ain't the 40s anymore, Pops. You think just 'cause you show up, we're gonna bend the knee?" Joe shook his head. "No, I think you're going to listen, because the alternative is a war you're not built for." A long pause. Then Marco raised a hand, calming the other two like dogs on leashes. "What do you want, Joe?" Joe exhaled slowly. "I want Tony Red's name cleared, publicly. He didn't talk. You know it. I know it. Make it right." Lil Sal scoffed. "You want us to throw away months of cleanup because some ghost in a suit says so?" Joe ignored him. "I also want the killings to stop. The old names. The guys who walked away. They ain't threats. They're just reminders. And you don't get to rewrite history by putting bullets in their backs." Matty spat on the floor. "And if we say no?" Joe stood up. He reached into his coat, and for a brief second, all three men tensed. But he didn't draw a gun. He pulled out a small photo and laid it on the table. It was Danny Betaro, hooked up to tubes, half-conscious, hospital lights washing his face in sterile color. The stabbing had nearly killed him. He was still recovering, barely able to talk. "I let him live," Joe said, voice ice cold. "That was a warning. You don't get two." The room went quiet. Marco stared at the photo. Something shifted in his face. Not fear, not anger, calculating. Then he looked up at Joe. "You're bluffing. You're alone." Joe smiled. "No, I'm old, which means I've got nothing left to lose. And that makes me more dangerous than any of you." He leaned down close. "You keep pushing this purge, I'll bury you with the same quiet I built this city on. And when it's done, no one will remember your names, just your mistakes." Marco finally nodded once. "We'll talk. Think it over." "You've got 3 days," Joe said. After that, I stopped talking. He turned and walked out. Luca and Pietro followed. No one fired a shot, not tonight. Back in the car, Joe didn't say a word for several minutes. Then he turned to Pietro. "Call Carmine. Tell him the fire's lit." "What do you think they'll do?" Luca asked. Joe lit a cigarette, his hand steady. "They'll either retreat, or they'll start shooting." "And you?" Joe looked out the window as the rain started falling harder against the windshield. "I'll be waiting either way." 3 days. That's what Joe gave them. 3 days to respond. 3 days to choose peace or blood. He didn't expect an answer, not directly. That wasn't how this world worked. There were no official announcements, no press releases, no stamped declarations. If they were going to retreat, they'd do it quietly. Orders would be pulled, contracts canceled, surveillance tapered off, a nod in a back room somewhere. That's how things ended when men respected the game. But if they were going to come for him, he knew the signs. The silence would feel different. Not cautious, but loaded. Like the second before a car bomb, like the breath before a trigger pull. And Joe had been breathing that air since the meeting in Gowanas. The safe house in Gravesend had been cleaned, walls swept for bugs, cameras checked. Luca and Pietro ran drills every night, watching windows, routes, entry points. There was always one gun within arm's reach. Joe didn't move like a hunted man. He moved like a king preparing for siege. He'd been here before, dozens of times, and every time the rule was the same. You don't win these wars with bullets. You win them with silence, planning, and striking when the other guy thinks you've already quit. He made calls, quiet ones, old connections, not friends, not allies, debts. Some men were still alive from the old days, some were barely breathing. But when they heard Joe's voice, they remembered, and that was enough. He activated 5 contacts. Leo Marchesi in Detroit still controlled the truck routes. Vito Bianchi in Chicago had muscle that didn't ask questions. Santo Greco in Toronto, ex-hitman, now a hotelier with dark favors. Louis the Chin in Jersey ran surveillance like the CIA. And Carla Marconi, a woman who once ran guns for Luciano, now retired, now curious. He didn't ask them to fight. He asked them to listen, to watch, and when the time came, to act with precision. On the second day, word came from Carmine. Matty Ricci had disappeared, just gone. No phone, no alibi, no trace. His crew was quiet, his apartment untouched. But he'd vanished like a guy who knew something was coming and didn't want to be around for the fallout. Joe heard the news and nodded once. That's the smart one, he muttered. Knew he was in over his head. 1 down, 2 left. That same night, a car followed Pietro. Not aggressively, just present. 3 blocks behind, then 2, then 4, then gone. A message. Pietro made it back to the safe house, told Joe everything. Joe didn't speak for a while, just poured himself a scotch. No ice. Then he said, "They're trying to see if I blink." He sipped. Didn't blink. The third night, a package arrived. No return address, no note. Inside the box, a dead pigeon, neck snapped, beak stuffed with a torn photograph. The photograph? Joe and Tony Red, 1947, Havana, standing side by side in front of a cabaret. A warning, a message, a mistake. Joe set the box aside and told Pietro to burn it. "They're amateurs," he said. "Because of the pigeon?" "No," Joe replied. "Because they're trying to scare a man who's already buried more friends than they've ever made." He didn't wait for them to strike. He moved first. Day 4. Joe called Carla Marconi. She was older now, late 60s, maybe more. Wore gray-like armor and smoked thin cigarettes like she still didn't care about cancer. She answered the phone with a dry, gravelly voice. "I thought you were dead," she said. "So did a lot of people." "What do you want, Joe?" "Names, surveillance, anything on Spinelli and Trina, no noise." There was a long pause. Then she said, "You planning to take him out?" "I'm planning to remind them I'm still alive." Another pause. Then, "You'll have it by tomorrow." Joe smiled. Carla never failed. That night, Joe sat alone on the balcony, cigarette lit, coat tight around his shoulders. The New York skyline stretched out in the distance, indifferent. Cold, full of ghosts. He didn't sleep, not because he was afraid, but because he could feel the storm building. The intel came the next evening. Carla delivered it personally. They met in a parked car on the Lower West Side. Carla sat in the back seat, legs crossed, manila folder in her lap. She wore sunglasses even though it was night. Joe liked that about her. She still had style. "They've been sloppy," she said, handing over the file. "Spinelli's been bouncing between 3 condos, all under shell names. Trina's been using a massage parlor in the Bronx as a front. They're both moving weight now. Small arms, coke, the usual. But here's the catch." Joe raised an eyebrow. "Yeah?" "They're working with outsiders." Joe narrowed his eyes. "What kind?" "Albanian, Ukrainian, maybe even Russian. No loyalty, just cash." Joe flipped through the folder. Photos, transactions, phone logs. "You know what that means?" Carla asked. Joe nodded. They're overextended, and they don't trust their own. Exactly. Joe closed the folder. This city's not theirs, he said. It never was. Carla looked at him for a long moment. Are you really going back in? I'm already in, she gave a slight nod. Then finish it, before they try to finish you. Later that night, Joe gave the order. He picked Trina first, the quiet one, the calculating one, the real threat. Luca and Pietro handled the prep. They didn't talk about it. They didn't ask why. They just prepared the tools, cars, burners, gloves, and a silenced .38 that hadn't been fired since '97. Joe planned it the way he always had. One strike, one shot, one less problem. March 4th, 2:17 a.m., the Bronx. Joe sat in the back of a black Lincoln parked half a block from the massage parlor. Pietro sat behind the wheel. Luca waited by the service alley. Inside the building, Marco Trina was alone. According to Carla's intel, he had no guards that night. The Albanians were late. The girls were off duty. Just Trina in his private office watching old surveillance tapes and sipping bourbon. Joe watched the clock. No adrenaline. Just clarity. When the time hit 2:28, he nodded. Luca moved first. 2 minutes later, the lights went out across the building. Breaker tripped, a planned blackout. Security cameras down, phones dead. Pietro moved next, entering through the alley, quiet as smoke. Joe followed. They found Trina in his office, standing confused, holding a flashlight, muttering about these damn junkie workers. He didn't recognize Joe at first, until Joe stepped into the light and smiled. Marco, Trina blinked, his lips parted, then closed. Adonis, Joe nodded. You were warned. Marco raised his hands, instinctive. This wasn't personal. It never is, Joe said. Then he shot him in the chest. 1 round. Clean. Trina collapsed against his desk, blood soaking through his suit. He looked up at Joe, gurgling. Joe leaned in close. I let Danny live. You're the message. They left the body where it dropped. They didn't run, didn't panic. By the time the cops got the anonymous tip, Joe was already back in Gravesend, sipping espresso and staring at the photo of Tony Red he kept folded in his coat pocket. He didn't smile. Not even when Carmine called later that morning. They found Trina, Carmine said, chest shot, dead on the floor. I know. You did it? Joe didn't answer. Carmine breathed out. Sal's next, isn't he? Joe took a long drag from his cigarette. I gave them 3 days. And now? Joe looked out the window. Now we finish what they started. March 7th. The city buzzed like a wire about to snap. News of Marco Trina's death spread fast. Faster than Joe expected and louder than anyone wanted. The cops found his body with a clean shot to the chest, lights still out in the building, no fingerprints, no forced entry. Just one bullet. One message. Joe Adonis was no longer a myth, he was real. And walking, and killing. The underworld split, you could feel it. Half the crews started going quiet, schedules canceled, soldiers kept home, some crews even shut down rackets for the week just to avoid being caught in crossfire. These weren't cowards, they were survivors, old instincts. They'd seen what happened when a legend picked up his blade again. The other half, they were afraid, but not afraid enough to back down. And at the center of that stubborn half sat one man, Salvatore Spinelli, Lil Sal. 38. Flashy, loud, the face of the purge. The man who thought the past was just a story you buried under Instagram filters and club tables. Sal didn't run, didn't hide. He called Joe's name out in coded messages, passive threats, subtle interviews, and backroom lounges where he pretended he wasn't sweating. But Joe knew better. Sal was waiting, yes. But under all that arrogance, he was shaking. And that made him dangerous. Because scared men do stupid things. Joe sat in the Gravesend safe house, reading the file Carla had updated for him. Sal's habits hadn't changed, still rotated through 3 apartments, one in Midtown, one in Tribeca, and the last in Williamsburg. But he'd tightened security since Trina dropped. hired ex-military contractors, full surveillance, encrypted comms. He knew the old rules, or at least he had advisors who did. But Joe wasn't looking to play chess. He wasn't circling the board. He was walking straight down the middle, one last name to cross off. Luca brought the car around that evening. Pietro loaded up, checking weapons, comms, escape routes. The plan was tight, more military op than mob hit, but Joe's focus was different tonight. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't nostalgia, it was principle. You don't let the rats take the house you built. You burn it down before they get too comfortable. 9:32 p.m., Tribeca. Sal's apartment was a penthouse, top floor of a converted textile building. All concrete, steel, glass. The kind of place you buy when you want people to know you've made it. Joe had been there once, years ago, before his exile. Back then, it was owned by a judge Joe used to bribe with Cuban cigars and theater tickets. Now it was full of men with earpieces and assault rifles. The approach had to be perfect. Pietro had tapped into the security feed 3 nights prior, found the rotation patterns, the one weakness, the freight elevator, used for trash removal at night. Guarded, yes, but lazily. One man, no camera facing the alley, 5-minute windows every hour. That was their entry. 10:03 p.m., alleyway behind the building. Joe stood in the shadows beside the service door. He was dressed in dark navy, gloves on, no jewelry, no flashy suit, just a man in a coat holding an old, suppressed Browning high power, the same model he used back in '58 when he put 2 bullets in a Cuban defector trying to flip for the feds. Luca took out the trash guard with a chokehold, silent, clean. Joe and Pietro moved through the freight entrance fast, 10 floors up, no words. At 10:07, they were in the hall outside Sal's penthouse. 2 guards stood at the door. Pietro threw a flashbang. The boom was sharp, blinding. Joe was through the smoke before the second echo faded. 2 clean shots. Both guards dropped. The hallway fell into that eerie kind of silence, the kind that only lasts 2 seconds before everything erupts. Inside, chaos. More guards scrambled. Sal's personal bodyman shouted commands. Someone opened fire through the wall, blindly. Joe ducked behind a marble bar. Pietro flanked right, firing in short bursts, controlled, efficient, 2 more down. Joe moved room to room, not fast, deliberate. He wasn't there to kill everyone, just one. He found Sal in the back room, office lit by a single desk lamp. The walls lined with pictures of Sal shaking hands with celebrities, politicians, other bosses, all of them pretending he was the future. Now he just looked like a cornered rat. Sal had a pistol, but he didn't raise it. He just looked at Joe, and for the first time, his mouth stayed shut. Joe stepped forward, gun raised. "You remember Havana?" he asked, calm. Sal blinked. "What?" "Tony Red introduced us, 1950. You were just a kid. Carried Tony's suitcase, dropped off envelopes. You were polite back then." Sal said nothing. Joe took another step forward. "You told the kid who killed him to slit his throat, because you thought no one would care." Sal's hand twitched. Joe shot him once in the knee. Sal dropped like a stone, screaming. The gun flew out of his hand. Joe walked over, kicked it away. "I gave you a choice," he said. "You picked the knife," Sal whimpered, holding his leg. "Please." Joe kneeled beside him. "This isn't about Tony. It's about order. You turned the commission into a clown show. You replaced loyalty with paranoia. You killed your own and wore sunglasses to the funerals." Sal choked back a sob. Joe raised the gun. "But most of all, you forgot the one rule that built this city." Sal whispered, "What rule?" Joe looked him in the eye. "You don't bury wolves and think they stay dead." And then he pulled the trigger. One shot, right between the eyes. No ceremony, no big speech, just closure. Pietro met him in the hallway. "Clear," he said. Joe nodded. "Burn it." Luca was already planting thermite charges in the security room. They wiped everything. Tapes, drives, laptops. Joe didn't want a shrine. He wanted a blackout. 11:42 p.m. The building burned slow, just the penthouse. No one died except who was meant to. The fire department arrived late. The police never came. Everyone knew better. By sunrise, the news was already buzzing. Lil Sal Spinelli, found dead. Gunshot. Fire. No suspects. The underworld didn't ask who did it. They already knew. Joe Adonis disappeared again that night. No trail, no plane ticket, no whispers, like a fog rolling back out to sea. The new blood was quiet for a long time after that. And the old names? They remembered why they used to bow their heads when Joe Adonis walked into a room. March 10th. There was no parade, no handshake, no coronation. Sal was dead. Trina was dead. Danny Betaro was in a hospital somewhere, missing a kidney and half his confidence. Joe had done what he came to do, burned the rot out of the core. But in this life, the end of violence doesn't mean peace. It means something new is about to start. For the first time in weeks, the city breathed differently. Crews started operating again, quietly, like kids sneaking back into the house after getting caught. Meetings resumed, small-time collections picked up. The high-level guys that had gone underground started creeping back out into cigar bars and backroom poker games. But something had changed. It was in the way they spoke Joe's name now. It wasn't said loudly, never was. But it wasn't said with mockery anymore. Now it came with respect, caution, and just enough fear to keep mouths shut and backs straight. Joe Adonis had reminded everyone that he was still a name that meant something. He didn't celebrate. He didn't send out victory messages, didn't gather the old heads, didn't sit at some long table and pretend to be a king. That wasn't him. He spent the morning in a diner on the edge of Staten Island, drinking black coffee and watching fog drift over the water. Luca sat across from him. Pietro stood near the back facing the windows, eyes moving like radar. The waitress, middle-aged, Bronx accent, looked like she used to smoke a pack a day, didn't recognize him, called him sweetheart when she refilled his cup. He liked that. He wasn't trying to be seen anymore. He was trying to remember who he was before all of this. "You think it's over?" Luca asked. Joe didn't answer right away. Then, "Nothing's ever over, but the bleeding stopped." Luca nodded slowly. "They'll want someone to fill the hole. They always do." "You gonna step back in?" Joe chuckled. "I'm not here to sit on a throne. I came back to tear it down." Pietro moved toward the table, lowered his voice. "We got eyes on a tail. Same SUV from last week. Same route." Joe wiped his mouth, folded his napkin. "They still think they can find an angle?" Pietro shrugged. "Or maybe they're just waiting to see where the dust settles." Joe stood, tossed a few bills on the table. "Then let's kick some dust in their face." Back at the safe house, there was a letter waiting, handwritten, delivered by someone who knew not to be seen. Joe opened it slowly, eyes scanning each word like they might bite him. "Joe, I heard what you did. It's not in the papers, but it's in the street. And if it's in the street, then it's already history. I don't know what you came back to prove, but you proved it. You're still a wolf. They just forgot how to howl." See, Joe read it twice, then folded it carefully and slid it into the inside pocket of his coat. He didn't need to ask who C was. Only Carla Marconi wrote like that. Sharp, cold, poetic. She was the only one left who still understood what power really looked like, and she was reminding him, without saying it, that there was still more to do. That night, Joe called Carmine Fortino. The line was quiet. No pleasantries. They didn't need any. "They're scrambling," Carmine said. "Crews are trying to reorganize. Nobody wants to lead. They're afraid of what's still out there. They think I want to run things again. Some do. Others hope you'll disappear before they have to find out." Joe exhaled smoke through his nose. "I'm not running anything." "Then what's the plan?" Joe leaned against the window, watching headlights roll across the street like lazy ghosts. "I'm going to make sure the right people do." Carmine was quiet for a long time. Then, "They'll need your blessing." Joe tapped ash into the tray. "They'll need more than that." March 14th. Joe arranged a meeting. Not a commissioned sit-down. Not a fancy show of strength. Just a conversation. In an abandoned boxing gym in the Bronx. No cameras, no foot soldiers. Just four men who still remembered what honor used to mean. Carmine came, of course. Then Angelo Vitale, a former capo who'd lost a leg in '79 and still wore a suit like he was going to mass. Paulie Russo, known as Clean Hands because he never pulled a trigger, but always knew who should. And finally, Vincent Skins Moretti, a wild card, but smart. Ran numbers out of Yonkers and never made a move without 3 layers of insulation. They all sat in folding chairs in the middle of the old ring. The gym was dusty, lit by a single hanging bulb. It smelled like sweat and memory. Joe stood, hands clasped behind his back. "I didn't bring you here to take orders," he began. "I brought you here to remind you what the hell this life was supposed to be about." They said nothing. He walked the ring like a preacher. "You've seen what happens when the wrong men get power. You saw what Spinelli did, what Trina let happen. They poisoned the well." Paulie nodded. "They had no code." "No respect," Angelo added. Joe stopped, looked each man in the eye. "I'm not stepping back in. My time's done. But I'm not leaving it to kids with cameras and coke habits. I'm leaving it to men who know how to run quiet, stay clean, and keep the blood where it belongs, out of sight." They all knew what he meant. "You want my blessing?" he said. "You get it. But you keep this thing in the dark where it belongs. You don't turn it into a circus. And if any of you start forgetting why you were put in charge, I'll come back." There was silence. Then nods. Slow. Respectful. Final. After the meeting, Carmine pulled Joe aside. "You sure you don't want a seat?" Joe smiled. "I had my seat. It was velvet and gold and cursed." Carmine nodded. "Then what's next?" Joe looked out into the night. "Closure." The next morning, he packed a small bag. No suits, no jewelry, no weapons, just the folded letter from Carla and the unsent letter to Ava, the one he wrote back in Italy. He told Pietro and Luca it was time. They didn't ask where. March 16th. He took a flight under a fake name, left from JFK, alone. Pietro and Luca stayed behind. "Hold the line," Joe told them. "The fire's out. Now keep it that way." They nodded. He didn't shake hands, didn't hug. He just walked away. The plane cut through clouds like it had somewhere important to be. Joe stared out the window, not at the sky, not at the stars, but inward, to every step that brought him here. A boy from Monte Marano, a runner, a club owner, a killer, a king. Now just a man with a name that still meant something, even if only in whispers. Naples, Italy, March 18th. The wind smelled the same, salt and smoke, olive groves, dust from 1,000 forgotten footsteps. Joe stepped off the train with one small bag slung over his shoulder and a wool coat that still held the shape of his back like an old friend. No guards, no entourage, no Pietro or Luca watching the corners. He was alone, for the first time in over 40 years. The platform was mostly empty. A priest smoking a pipe near the benches. A young couple kissing like no one would ever hurt them. A boy selling roasted chestnuts from a rusty cart. No one noticed him. That's how Joe liked it now. He didn't move like a man expecting trouble anymore. He moved like a man who had already lived through it and came back to see what was left. He didn't go back to the villa. He hadn't set foot in that place since he left for New York. It had been cleaned out, he assumed, locked up, maybe taken by the government or bought by some tech executive who wanted to feel authentic. Didn't matter. It wasn't home. Not then. Not now. Instead, he checked into a modest inn near the coast, the kind of place you only find if you're not looking. Run by a widow who didn't ask questions and brought him espresso every morning without a word. Joe liked her immediately. She reminded him of the women from Brooklyn, stern, sharp-eyed, and always 10 steps ahead of whatever lie you were about to tell. The days passed slowly. Joe didn't fill them with much. Walks, cigarettes, a little writing, the radio, reading old books he'd never had time for. He watched the sea from his balcony each night like it might confess something to him if he stared long enough. But there was one thing he hadn't done yet. One thing he was putting off. Eva. He'd written the letter almost a year ago, kept it folded in the same pocket ever since, carried it through the safe house in Gravesend, through shootouts and betrayals, through blood and fire. And now he was finally going to deliver it. But not by post, not by courier. He was going to look her in the eyes, if she still lived here, if she still wanted to see him, if she even remembered. He took a cab through the hills toward Sorrento. The address burned into his memory. She'd given it to him in a letter she sent 15 years ago, back when she still hoped he'd come back a different man. The house was small, white, flowers in the window, one chair on the porch, a wooden door that looked like it had been knocked on by better men than him. Joe stood there for a long minute, heart beating with a slow, deep thud. Not nervous, just aware. This wasn't like walking into a room full of killers. This was worse. This was walking into a room where the past still had a voice. He knocked. Nothing at first. Then soft footsteps. The door opened slowly. And there she was. Eva. Older, yes. The lines around her eyes deeper. Her hair silver, pulled back in a loose bun. But the eyes, those eyes, hadn't changed. Still dark, still watchful, still powerful enough to shut his mouth without saying a word. She stared at him. Didn't blink, didn't flinch. Then she said, "Jesus, Joe, you actually came." They didn't hug. They didn't cry. They sat on the porch, in silence at first, like two statues finally facing the sun again. Eva made coffee. He lit a cigarette. The wind rolled in soft from the sea. It was all too still for what they were carrying between them. "You look tired," she said finally. Joe exhaled smoke. "I buried some people. I heard." "How much?" "Enough." A long pause. "You gonna tell me the rest?" she asked. Joe looked at her. "No," she nodded. "Good. I wouldn't want you to." They talked about simple things for a while. The weather, her garden, the food, the neighbors. Joe didn't ask if she'd remarried, didn't ask if she had children, didn't want to know. He wasn't there to claim anything. He was there to confess something, even if it was without words. Finally, after an hour, he reached into his coat, pulled out the old envelope. "I wrote this a year ago," he said. "Carried it the whole way." Ava looked at it but didn't reach for it. "You want me to read it?" "No, just wanted you to know I meant it." A slow breath. "What did it say?" Joe stared at the sky. "That I was sorry, that I missed you, that you were the only thing in my life that didn't come with a body count." She smiled, sad. "Sounds like you." Joe placed the letter on the table between them, and then, like something in him broke quietly, he said, "I loved you, Eva." She didn't speak, just stared at him with those same eyes, eyes that had seen him at his worst, loved him anyway, and left when she realized she had to. Then she reached out and touched his hand, warm, gentle, final. "I know, Joe." He stayed for dinner. They didn't talk about the Mafia. They didn't talk about New York. They didn't even talk about the men he killed. They talked about them, before the money, before the blood, before the exile. She told him about the nights in Havana, the time they danced barefoot in the hallway of the Hotel Nacional, the time he taught her how to cheat at poker, the time she threatened to leave him if he ever brought a gun into their bedroom again. They laughed, and for a few hours Joe didn't feel like a gangster. He felt like a man who used to be one. He left just before midnight. No kiss, no long goodbye. Just a quiet nod between two people who'd already said everything they needed to in the silence between their words. Before he walked away, she said, "You still have time." Joe turned back. "Time for what?" "To decide how your story ends." He looked at her for a long moment, then walked into the night. Back at the inn, Joe stood on the balcony and lit his last cigarette of the evening. He looked out at the sea, wind cutting across his face like a whisper from a god he didn't believe in. And he thought about her words. Time. Not much of it, but maybe enough. March 20th, Naples, Italy. Joe stood barefoot on the balcony of the inn, cigarette between two fingers, black coffee cooling on the rail beside him. The morning fog was low, rolling in from the sea, dulling everything to a soft, faded gray. The kind of morning where the world feels like it's holding its breath. Joe didn't like mornings like this, too quiet, too uncertain. Behind him, the small transistor radio played a scratchy jazz station. The horn section wept low into the air like it was apologizing for something it couldn't fix. Joe sipped the coffee. Still bitter. Still good. Then a knock came. He turned slowly. The old innkeeper stood there, her face unreadable, eyes low. "Someone left this for you," she said, her voice dry as gravel. She handed him a small envelope. No stamp, no name. Joe took it, nodded. She walked away without another word. He shut the door behind him. The room was dim, one chair, one table. A half-finished book and a leather duffel sat where he left them. He opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single photograph, color, slightly crumpled, fresh. It was of Pietro, bound to a chair, head bruised, blood on his temple. There was a word scrawled in black marker across the photo. Come. No return address, no demands, just the photo. Just that word. Joe stared at it for a long time. His hand didn't shake. His breath didn't hitch. But his jaw clenched, tight enough that a nerve ticked in his cheek. This wasn't business. This wasn't power. This was a message. One meant for him and him alone. And it was written in the only language he truly understood. He didn't tell the innkeeper he was leaving. Didn't pack much. Just the leather bag, the .38 revolver he'd buried in the lining, and the photo of Ava from Havana. He took the first flight back to Zurich, then to Toronto, then crossed into Buffalo in the back of a truck, driven by a man who never once asked Joe for his name. From there, it was a 2-hour drive to Newark, to a warehouse Joe had hoped to never walk into again. Carmine was waiting when he arrived. He stood near the edge of the loading dock, arms folded, cigarette burning low, the smoke curling around his balding head like a halo of regret. "You got the photo," Carmine said without turning around. Joe nodded. "Where is he?" Carmine flicked ash to the ground. "I don't know, but I know who took him." Joe waited. "Vincent Moretti." "Skins." Joe's face hardened. "Why?" Carmine shook his head. "He never liked what you did. Thought you should have taken the seat. Thought you left the table open for too long. He's building something new, something sick." Joe's voice was low, cold. "He was at that meeting." "He was, and he lied to you." Joe said nothing. It all made sense now. Skins had played the long game. He let Joe do the cleaning. Let him erase Sal, Trina, and the rest. Let the blood spill in a way that cleared the chessboard. And now he wanted to step into the silence. But to do that, he had to erase the past completely. That meant Pietro, and probably Luca too. And then, finally, Joe. "Where's Luca?" Joe asked. Carmine's voice lowered. "Gone dark. Last I heard he was in Jersey asking around about Skins' new crew." Joe's eyes narrowed. If Skins touched him too, he didn't. Yet. Joe turned away from the dock, staring out at the shipping yard. It was all rust and silence, just like his thoughts. Then, finally, he spoke. "Find me a location." That night, Joe stayed in a motel off the turnpike. A place with plastic sheets on the chairs and a blinking vacancy sign out front that looked like it hadn't worked since the Reagan years. He laid the photo of Pietro on the table, sat in the dark, stared. His friend, his shadow. The man who followed him into exile without question, who stood by his side during the fire, who never once asked why. Now, beaten and tied up by a snake Joe had once blessed with a seat at the table. Joe opened the duffel and pulled out the revolver, clean, heavy, loaded. He didn't need more than one shot, but he packed extra anyway. March 22nd, 11:47 p.m. Carmine called. "Warehouse, Union City, 3rd and Ferry." Joe was already dressed, black again, no tie, just death in his pockets and ghosts on his breath. "Security? 6 men, all new, sloppy. Pietro? Alive in the basement." Joe didn't ask how Carmine knew. He just said, "Be ready to clean up." The warehouse looked like a tomb. Flickering lights, steel doors, the smell of oil and wet rope. Joe approached from the rear, cutting through the alley. He moved like smoke, slow, invisible. He'd done this too many times to forget how. 2 guards at the back door. He took them both out, one with a shot to the throat, the other with the butt of his gun. Fast, brutal, no sound. Inside, the hallway stretched dark and narrow. Joe moved like he belonged there, because in a way, He did. This world was his home, and someone had broken in. He found Pietro in the basement, barely conscious, but breathing. Joe knelt beside him. "Hey," he whispered. Pietro opened one swollen eye, tried to speak. Joe put a hand on his shoulder. "You're good. I'm here." Pietro smiled weakly. "You always come late," Joe chuckled dry. Habit, he cut the ropes, helped him sit against the wall, then handed him a pistol. "Can you stand?" Pietro nodded. "I can shoot. Standing's optional." Joe grinned. "Good enough." Then he went upstairs. No hesitation. Skins was waiting in the main room, sitting behind a desk like he was still running numbers out of Yonkers. When he saw Joe, he smirked. "I figured you'd come." Joe raised the gun. "Then you're dumber than you look." "You still think this world runs on respect?" Joe stepped forward. "I think it runs on memory, and your kind don't have one." Skins laughed. "That world's gone, Joe. You cleaned it out. Now there's space for something new." Joe didn't blink. "I didn't clean it for you." And he pulled the trigger. One shot, dead center. Skins dropped like a sack of cash. No last words, no redemption arc, just a bullet and the truth it carried. Joe stood over the body, then turned, walked out. Outside, sirens started to wail in the distance. Joe helped Pietro into the car. As they pulled away, Joe looked back once, just once. Then he said, "It's done." And for the first time, he meant it. March 27th, somewhere near Montemerano, Italy. Joe hadn't spoken a word in hours. The car twisted through the hills of southern Italy like it remembered him. The narrow roads familiar, the olive trees reaching out like old friends too proud to wave. He didn't look at the clock. Time didn't matter anymore. He wasn't running, wasn't chasing, wasn't building or destroying. He was returning. Not to the place he was born, but to the man he used to be. They reached the house just before sunset. It wasn't big, wasn't fancy. 2 stories, stucco walls, a garden out front that hadn't been trimmed in years, a rusted gate, one broken shutter swinging softly in the wind. Joe stepped out of the car, alone. The driver didn't speak, didn't ask who he was or why he'd come. Joe walked through the gate, his shoes crunching gravel with that familiar heavy rhythm. There was a bench near the front door. He sat, lit a cigarette, and waited. 30 minutes passed. The door opened slowly. Ava stood there, older than ever, wrapped in a shawl, eyes still sharp, still watching. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. She just walked out, sat beside him on the bench, and took the cigarette from his fingers. She smoked it, slowly, then handed it back. "You look tired," she said. Joe smiled. "I think I'm finished." She looked at him, long, soft, serious. "No one like you has ever finished, Joe." He nodded. "Then maybe I'm just ready." "For what?" He looked at the mountains. The quiet. They talked for hours, about nothing mostly. The way people do when they've already lived the hard parts and don't need to relive them anymore. She asked about Pietro. Joe said he was healing, that he'd gone back to Sicily for now. Said he might open a little bar if his hands stopped shaking. She asked about Carmine. Joe said he was still doing what Carmine does best, managing from the shadows, always worried, always loyal. She didn't ask about Luca. Joe didn't mention him either. Some goodbyes don't need to be spoken aloud. Then she asked the question that had been sitting between them for years. "Do you regret it?" Joe didn't answer right away. He lit another cigarette, let the smoke rise, watched the shadows stretch across the vineyard. "I regret that I let it matter more than you." She didn't cry, didn't flinch, just nodded. "I know." As the stars came out, she stood. "You staying?" Joe looked at the house. "No, but I'll be nearby." She smiled faintly. "I always knew you'd come back, one way or another." He nodded. "I just didn't know if I'd come back standing." She kissed him on the cheek, soft, lingering. Then walked back inside, left the door slightly open, like an old wound finally healing. April 1st, Amalfi Coast. Joe rented a small villa on a cliff. 1 bedroom, no phone, no guards, Just stone walls, clean linens, and a balcony that overlooked the endless sea. He woke when he wanted, ate what he liked, walked each morning down to the market and bought bread from a woman who always greeted him in dialect. He told her his name was Giovanni. She never asked for more. Each afternoon, he sat in the same chair on the balcony, wearing the same coat he wore in Brooklyn, smoking the same brand of cigarettes he'd smoked in Havana. And each night, he wrote, not for a book, not for legacy, but for himself. Short stories, memories, scenes from a life that never got to feel like his own. He never mailed anything, just filled the pages one by one and kept them in a shoebox under the bed. He titled the box with a piece of duct tape. It said, "Let it rot, or let someone remember." Sometimes Ava visited. Not often, not planned. She'd bring wine, they'd talk, or not. She'd sit across from him, facing the sea, and they'd share a silence that wasn't heavy anymore. Just comfortable. She always left before dawn. Joe never asked why. He never had to. May 6th. A letter arrived. It came in a plain white envelope with no return address, slipped under his door sometime during the night. He opened it slowly, hands steady. Inside was a photo of young Joe, from the 1940s, standing beside Lucky Luciano in a restaurant booth, both of them laughing, cigars in hand, shirts rolled at the sleeves like they owned the world. On the back was a message in ink. "You were always the one who kept the wolves honest. Now the forest is quiet again." No signature. He knew who it was from. Carla. Always watching. Always writing. Joe placed the photo beside his typewriter. Then he sat, lit a cigarette, and wrote his final words in the last notebook. He didn't write a dramatic ending, didn't quote Shakespeare or Sinatra. He wrote something simple, something true. "I was a boy from nothing who became everything and forgot how to sleep at night. But I remembered, before it was too late. My name is Joe Adonis. And this is where it stops. Not with a bang, not with blood, but with a breath." That night the sea was calm, the sky full of stars. Joe stepped onto the balcony with his last cigarette, sat in his chair, and watched the dark roll in over the water, eyes half closed, hands still, mind clear, no regret, no fear, no unfinished business, just a man at peace.